Section 10 of Hard Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joseph Ugaretz. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Section 10, Book 2, Chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2, Mr. James Harthouse. The Gradgrind party wanted assistance in cutting the throats of the Graces. They went about recruiting, and where could they enlist recruits more hopefully than among the fine gentlemen who, having found out everything to be worth nothing, were equally ready for anything? Moreover, the healthy spirits who had mounted to this sublime height were attractive to many of the Gradgrind school. They liked fine gentlemen. They pretended they did not, but they did. They became exhausted in imitation of them, and they yawed in their speech like them, and they served out, with an enervated air, the little mouldy rations of political economy on which they regaled their disciples. There never before was seen on earth such a wonderful hybrid race as was thus produced. Among the fine gentlemen not regularly belonging to the Gradgrind school, there was one of a good family and a better appearance, with a happy turn of humour, which had told immensely with the House of Commons on the occasion of his entertaining it with his and the Board of Directors' view of a railway accident, in which the most careful officers ever known, employed by the most liberal managers ever heard of, assisted by the finest mechanical contrivances ever devised, the whole in action on the best line ever constructed, had killed 5 people and wounded 32, by a casualty without which the excellence of the whole system would have been positively incomplete. Among the slain was a cow, and among the scattered articles unowned a widow's cap. And the honourable member had so tickled the House, which has a delicate sense of humour, by putting the cap on the cow, that it became impatient of any serious reference to the coroner's inquest, and brought the railway off with cheers and laughter. Now, this gentleman had a younger brother of still better appearance than himself, who had tried life as a cornet of dragoons, and found it a bore, and had afterwards tried it in the train of an English minister abroad, and found it a bore, and had then strolled to Jerusalem, and got bored there, and had then gone yachting about the world, and got bored everywhere. To whom this honourable and jocular member fraternally said one day, "Jem, there's a good opening among the hard fact fellows, and they want men. I wonder you don't go in for statistics." Jem, rather taken by the novelty of the idea and very hard up for a change, was as ready to go in for statistics as for anything else, so he went in. He coached himself up with a blue book or two, and his brother put it about among the hard fact fellows, and said, "If you want to bring in for any place a handsome dog who can make you a devilish good speech, look after my brother Jem, for he's your man." After a few dashes in the public meeting way, Mr. Gradgrind and a council of political sages approved of Jem, and it was resolved to send him down to Coketown, to become known there and in the neighbourhood. Hence the letter Jem had last night shown to Mrs. Sparsit, which Mr. Bounderby now held in his hand, superscribed, "Josiah Bounderby, Esquire, Banker, Coketown, specially to introduce James Harthouse, Esquire, Thomas Gradgrind." Within an hour of the receipt of this dispatch and Mr. James Harthouse's card, Mr. Bounderby put on his hat and went down to the hotel. There he found Mr. James Harthouse looking out of window in a state of mind so disconsolate that he was already half disposed to go in for something else. "My name, sir," said his visitor, "is Josiah Bounderby of Coketown." Mr. James Harthouse was very happy indeed, though he scarcely looked so, to have a pleasure he had long expected. "Coketown, sir," said Bounderby, obstinately taking a chair, "is not the kind of place you have been accustomed to. Therefore, if you will allow me, or whether you will or not, for I am a plain man, I'll tell you something about it before we go any further. Mr. Harthouse would be charmed." "Don't be too sure of that," said Mr. Bounderby. "I don't promise it. First of all, you see our smoke. That's meat and drink to us. It's the healthiest thing in the world in all respects, and particularly for the lungs. If you are one of those who want us to consume it, I differ from you. We are not going to wear the bottoms of our boilers out any faster than we wear 'em out now, for all the humbugging sentiment in Great Britain and Ireland." By way of going in to the fullest extent, Mr. Harthouse rejoined, Mr. Bounderby, I assure you I am entirely and completely of your way of thinking, on conviction." "I'm glad to hear it," said Bounderby. "Now, you have heard a lot of talk about the work in our mills, no doubt. You have? Very good. I'll state the fact of it to you. It's the pleasantest work there is, and it's the lightest work there is, and it's the best paid work there is. More than that, we couldn't improve the mills themselves unless we laid down Turkey carpets on the floors, which we're not a-going to do." "Mr. Bounderby, perfectly right." "Lastly," said Bounderby, "as to our hands. There's not a hand in this town, sir, man, woman, or child, but has one ultimate object in life. That object is to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon. Now, they're not a-going, none of them, ever to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon, and now you know the place." Mr. Harthouse professed himself in the highest degree instructed and refreshed by this condensed epitome of the whole Coketown question. "Why, you see," replied Mr. Bounderby, "it suits my disposition to have a full understanding with a man, particularly with a public man, when I make his acquaintance. I have only one thing more to say to you, Mr. Harthouse, before assuring you of the pleasure with which I shall respond, to the utmost of my poor ability, to my friend Tom Gradgrind's letter of introduction. You are a man of family. Don't you deceive yourself by supposing for a moment that I am a man of family. I'm a bit of dirty riffraff, and a genuine scrap of tag, rag, and bobtail." If anything could have exalted Jem's interest in Mr. Bounderby, it would have been this very circumstance, or so he told him. "So now," said Bounderby, "we may shake hands on equal terms. I say equal terms, because, although I know what I am, and the exact depth of the gutter I have lifted myself out of better than any man does, I am as proud as you are. I am just as proud as you are. Having now asserted my independence in a proper manner, I may come to how do you find yourself? And I hope you're pretty well." The better, Mr. Harthouse gave him to understand as they shook hands, for the salubrious air of Coketown. Mr. Bounderby received the answer with favour. "Perhaps you know," said he, "or perhaps you don't know, I married Tom Gradgrind's daughter. If you have nothing better to do than to walk up town with me, I shall be glad to introduce you to Tom Gradgrind's daughter." "Mr. Bounderby," said Jem, "you anticipate my dearest wishes." They went out without further discourse, and Mr. Bounderby piloted the new acquaintance who so strongly contrasted with him, to the private red brick dwelling, with the black outside shutters, the green inside blinds, and the black street door, up the 2 white steps. In the drawing-room of which mansion there presently entered to them the most remarkable girl Mr. James Harthouse had ever seen. She was so constrained, and yet so careless, so reserved, and yet so watchful, so cold and proud, and yet so sensitively ashamed of her husband's braggart humility, from which she shrunk as if every example of it were a cut or a blow, that it was quite a new sensation to observe her. In face she was no less remarkable than in manner. Her features were handsome, but their natural play was so locked up that it seemed impossible to guess at their genuine expression. Utterly indifferent, perfectly self-reliant, never at a loss, and yet never at her ease, with her figure in company with them there, and her mind apparently quite alone. It was of no use going in yet a while to comprehend this girl, for she baffled all penetration. From the mistress of the house the visitor glanced to the house itself. There was no mute sign of a woman in the room, no graceful little adornment, no fanciful little device, however trivial, anywhere expressed her influence. Cheerless and comfortless, boastfully and doggedly rich, there the room stared at its present occupants, unsoftened and unrelieved by the least trace of any womanly occupation. As Mr. Bounderby stood in the midst of his household gods, so those unrelenting divinities occupied their places around Mr. Bounderby, and they were worthy of one another, and well matched. "This, sir," said Bounderby, "is my wife, Mrs. Bounderby, Tom Gradgrind's eldest daughter, Loo. Mr. James Harthouse. Mr. Harthouse, Loo, has joined your father's muster roll. If he is not Tom Gradgrind's colleague before long, I believe we shall at least hear of him in connection with one of our neighbouring towns. You observe, Mr. Harthouse, that my wife is my junior. I don't know what she saw in me to marry me, but she saw something in me, I suppose, or she wouldn't have married me. She has lots of expensive knowledge, sir, political and otherwise. If you want to cram for anything, I should be troubled to recommend you to a better adviser than Loo Bounderby." To a more agreeable adviser, or one from whom he would be more likely to learn, Mr. Harthouse could never be recommended. "Come," said his host, "if you're in the complimentary line, you'll get on here, for you'll meet with no competition. I have never been in the way of learning compliments myself, and I don't profess to understand the art of paying 'em. In fact, despise 'em. But your bringing up was different from mine. Mine was a real thing, by George. You're a gentleman, and I don't pretend to be one. I am Josiah Bounderby of Coketown, and that's enough for me. However, though I am not influenced by manners and station, Lou Bounderby may be. She hadn't my advantages. Disadvantages, you would call 'em, but I call 'em advantages, so you'll not waste your power, I dare say." "Mr. Bounderby," said Jem, turning with a smile to Louisa, "is a noble animal in a comparatively natural state, quite free from the harness in which a conventional hack like myself works." "You respect Mr. Bounderby very much," she quietly returned. "It is natural that you should." He was disgracefully thrown out, for a gentleman who had seen so much of the world, and thought, "Now, how am I to take this?" "You are going to devote yourself, as I gather from what Mr. Bounderby has said, to the service of your country. You have made up your mind," said Louisa, still standing before him where she had first stopped, in all the singular contrariety of her self-possession, and her being obviously very ill at ease, "to show the nation the way out of all its difficulties." "Mrs. Bounderby," he returned, laughing, "upon my honour, no. I will make no such pretence to you. I have seen a little, here and there, up and down. I have found it all to be very worthless, as everybody has, and as some confess they have, and some do not, and I am going in for your respected father's opinions, really because I have no choice of opinions, and may as well back them as anything else." "Have you none of your own?" asked Louisa. "I have not so much as the slightest predilection left. I assure you I attach not the least importance to any opinions. The result of the varieties of boredom I have undergone is a conviction, unless conviction is too industrious a word for the lazy sentiment I entertain on the subject, that any set of ideas will do just as much good as any other set, and just as much harm as any other set. There's an English family with a charming Italian motto, 'What will be, will be.' It's the only truth going." This vicious assumption of honesty and dishonesty, a vice so dangerous, so deadly, and so common, seemed, he observed, a little to impress her in his favour. He followed up the advantage by saying in his pleasantest manner, a manner to which she might attach as much or as little meaning as she pleased, "The side that can prove anything in a line of units, tens, hundreds, and thousands, Mrs. Bounderby, seems to me to afford the most fun, and to give a man the best chance. I am quite as much attached to it as if I believed it. I am quite ready to go in for it, to the same extent as if I believed it. And what more could I possibly do, if I did believe it?" "You are a singular politician," said Louisa. "Pardon me, I have not even that merit. We are the largest party in the state, I assure you, Mrs. Bounderby, if we all fell out of our adopted ranks and were reviewed together." Mr. Bounderby, who had been in danger of bursting in silence, interposed here with a project for postponing the family dinner till 6:30, and taking Mr. James Harthouse, in the meantime, on a round of visits to the voting and interesting notabilities of Coketown and its vicinity. The round of visits was made, and Mr. James Harthouse, with a discreet use of his blue coaching, came off triumphantly, though with a considerable accession of boredom. In the evening he found the dinner-table laid for 4, but they sat down only 3. It was an appropriate occasion for Mr. Bounderby to discuss the flavour of the ha'porth of stewed eels he had purchased in the streets at 8 years old, and also of the inferior water, specially used for laying the dust, with which he had washed down that repast. He likewise entertained his guests over the soup and fish, with the calculation that he, Bounderby, had eaten in his youth at least 3 horses under the guise of polonies and saveloys. These recitals Jem, in a languid manner, received with "Charming" every now and then, and they probably would have decided him to go in for Jerusalem again to-morrow, had he been less curious respecting Louisa. "Is there nothing," he thought, glancing at her as she sat at the head of the table, where her youthful figure, small and slight, but very graceful, looked as pretty as if misplaced, "is there nothing that will move that face?" Yes, by Jupiter, there was something, and here it was in an unexpected shape. Tom appeared. She changed as the door opened, and broke into a beaming smile. A beautiful smile. Mr. James Harthouse might not have thought so much of it, but that he had wondered so long at her impassive face. She put out her hand, a pretty little soft hand, and her fingers closed upon her brother's, as if she would have carried them to her lips. "Aye, aye," thought the visitor, "this whelp is the only creature she cares for? So. The whelp was presented, and took his chair. The appellation was not flattering, but not unmerited. "When I was your age, young Tom," said Bounderby, "I was punctual, or I got no dinner." "When you were my age," resumed Tom, "you hadn't a wrong balance to get right, and you hadn't to dress afterwards." "Never mind that now," said Bounderby. "Well then," grumbled Tom, "don't begin with me." "Mrs. Bounderby," said Harthouse, perfectly hearing this understrain as it went on, "your brother's face is quite familiar to me. Can I have seen him abroad, or at some public school, perhaps?" "No," she resumed, quite interested. "He has never been abroad yet, and was educated here at home. Tom, love, I'm telling Mr. Harthouse that he never saw you abroad." "No such luck, sir," said Tom. There was little enough in him to brighten her face, for he was a sullen young fellow, and ungracious in his manner even to her. So much the greater must have been the solitude of her heart, and her need of someone on whom to bestow it. So much the more is this whelp the only creature she has ever cared for, thought Mr. James Harthouse, turning it over and over. So much the more. So much the more. Both in his sister's presence, and after she had left the room, the whelp took no pains to hide his contempt for Mr. Bounderby, whenever he could indulge it without the observation of that independent man, by making wry faces or shutting one eye. Without responding to these telegraphic communications, Mr. Harthouse encouraged him much in the course of the evening, and showed an unusual liking for him. At last, when he rose to return to his hotel, and was a little doubtful whether he knew the way by night, the whelp immediately proffered his services as guide, and turned out with him to escort him thither. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Whelp. It was very remarkable that a young gentleman who had been brought up under one continuous system of unnatural restraint should be a hypocrite, but it was certainly the case with Tom. It was very strange that a young gentleman who had never been left to his own guidance for 5 consecutive minutes should be incapable at last of governing himself, but so it was with Tom. It was altogether unaccountable that a young gentleman whose imagination had been strangled in his cradle should be still inconvenienced by its ghost in the form of grovelling sensualities, but such a monster, beyond all doubt, was Tom. "Do you smoke?" asked Mr. James Harthouse, when they came to the hotel. "I believe you," said Tom. He could do no less than ask Tom up, and Tom could do no less than go up. What with a cooling drink adapted to the weather, but not so weak as cool, and what with a rarer tobacco than was to be bought in those parts, Tom was soon in a highly free and easy state at his end of the sofa, and more than ever disposed to admire his new friend at the other end. Tom blew his smoke aside after he had been smoking a little while, and took an observation of his friend. "He don't seem to care about his dress," thought Tom, "and yet how capitally he does it. What an easy swell he is." Mr. James Harthouse, happening to catch Tom's eye, remarked that he drank nothing, and filled his glass with his own negligent hand. "Thank'ee," said Tom, "thank'ee. Well, Mr. Harthouse, I hope you have had about a dose of old Bounderby to-night." Tom said this with one eye shut up again, and looked over his glass knowingly at his entertainer. "A very good fellow indeed," returned Mr. James Harthouse. "You think so, don't you?" said Tom, and he shut up his eye again. Mr. James Harthouse smiled, and rising from his end of the sofa, and lounging with his back against the chimney-piece so that he stood before the empty fire-grate as he smoked, in front of Tom, and looking down at him, observed, "What a comical brother-in-law you are!" "What a comical brother-in-law old Bounderby is, I think you mean," said Tom. "You are a piece of caustic, Tom," retorted Mr. James Harthouse. There was something so very agreeable in being so intimate with such a waistcoat, in being called Tom in such an intimate way by such a voice, in being on such off-hand terms so soon with such a pair of whiskers, that Tom was uncommonly pleased with himself. "Oh, I don't care for old Bounderby," said he, "if you mean that. I have always called old Bounderby by the same name when I have talked about him, and I have always thought of him in the same way. I'm not going to begin to be polite now about old Bounderby. It would be rather late in the day." "Don't mind me," returned James, "but take care when his wife is by, you know." "His wife?" said Tom. "My sister Lou? Oh, yes." And he laughed and took a little more of the cooling drink. James Harthouse continued to lounge in the same place and attitude, smoking his cigar in his own easy way, and looking pleasantly at the whelp as if he knew himself to be a kind of agreeable demon who had only to hover over him, and he must give up his whole soul if required. It certainly did seem that the whelp yielded to this influence. He looked at his companion sneakingly, he looked at him admiringly, he looked at him boldly, and put up one leg on the sofa. "My sister Lou," said Tom, "she never cared for old Bounderby." "That's the past tense, Tom," returned Mr. James Harthouse, striking the ash from his cigar with his little finger. "We are in the present tense now." Verb neuter, not to care. Indicative mood, present tense. First person singular, I do not care. Second person singular, thou dost not care. Third person singular, she does not care, returned Tom. "Good, very quaint," said his friend, "though you don't mean it." "But I do mean it," cried Tom, "upon my honour. Why, you won't tell me, Mr. Harthouse, that you really suppose my sister Lou does care for old Bounderby?" "My dear fellow," returned the other, "what am I bound to suppose, when I find two married people living in harmony and happiness?" Tom had by this time got both his legs on the sofa. If his second leg had not been already there when he was called a dear fellow, he would have put it up at that great stage of the conversation. Feeling it necessary to do something then, he stretched himself out at greater length, and reclining with the back of his head on the end of the sofa, and smoking with an infinite assumption of negligence, turned his common face, and not too sober eyes, toward the face looking down upon him so carelessly yet so potently. "You know our governor, Mr. Harthouse," said Tom, "and therefore you needn't be surprised that Lou married old Bounderby. She never had a lover, and the governor proposed old Bounderby, and she took him." "Very dutiful in your interesting sister," said Mr. James Harthouse. "Yes, but she wouldn't have been as dutiful, and it would not have come off as easily," returned the whelp, "if it hadn't been for me." The tempter merely lifted his eyebrows, but the whelp was obliged to go on. "I persuaded her," he said, with an edifying air of superiority. "I was stuck into old Bounderby's bank, where I never wanted to be, and I knew I should get into scrapes there if she put old Bounderby's pipe out, so I told her my wishes, and she came into them. She would do anything for me. It was very game of her, wasn't it?" "It was charming, Tom." "Not that it was altogether so important to her as it was to me," continued Tom coolly, "because my liberty and comfort, and perhaps my getting on, depended on it, and she had no other lover. Staying at home was like staying in jail, especially when I was gone. It wasn't as if she gave up another lover for old Bounderby, but still it was a good thing in her." "Perfectly delightful, and she gets on so placidly." "Oh," returned Tom with a contemptuous patronage, "she's a regular girl. A girl can get on anywhere. She has settled down to the life, and she don't mind. It does just as well as another. Besides, though Lou is a girl, she's not a common sort of girl. She can shut herself up within herself, and think, as I have often known her sit and watch the fire for an hour at a stretch." Aye, has resources of her own," said Harthouse, smoking quietly. "Not so much of that as you may suppose," returned Tom, "for our governor had her crammed with all sorts of dry bones and sawdust. It's his system." "Formed his daughter on his own model?" suggested Harthouse. "His daughter? Aye, and everybody else. Why, he formed me that way," said Tom. "Impossible!" "He did, though," said Tom, shaking his head. "I mean to say, Mr. Harthouse, that when I first left home and went to old Bounderby's, I was flat as a warming pan, and knew no more about life than any oyster does." "Come, Tom, I can hardly believe that. A joke's a joke." "Upon my soul," said the whelp, "I am serious. I am indeed." He smoked with great gravity and dignity for a little while, and then added, in a highly complacent tone, "Oh, I have picked up a little since, I don't deny that, but I've done it myself. No thanks to the governor." "And your intelligent sister?" "My intelligent sister is about where she was. She used to complain to me that she had nothing to fall back upon, that girls usually fall back upon, and I don't see how she is to have got over that since. But she don't mind," he sagaciously added, puffing at his cigar again. "Girls can always get on somehow." Calling at the bank yesterday evening for Mr. Bounderby's address, I found an ancient lady there who seems to entertain great admiration for your sister," observed Mr. James Harthouse, throwing away the last small remnant of the cigar he had now smoked out. "Mother Sparsit," said Tom. "What? You've seen her already, have you?" His friend nodded. Tom took his cigar out of his mouth to shut up his eye, which had grown rather unmanageable with the greater expression, and to tap his nose several times with his finger. "Mother Sparsit's feeling for Lou is more than admiration, I should think," said Tom. "Say affection and devotion. Mother Sparsit never set her cap at Bounderby when he was a bachelor. Oh, no." These were the last words spoken by the whelp before a giddy drowsiness came upon him, followed by complete oblivion. He was roused from the latter state by an uneasy dream of being stirred up with a boot, and also of a voice saying, "Come, it's late. Be off." "Well," he said, scrambling from the sofa, I must take my leave of you, though. I say yours is very good tobacco, but it's too mild." "Yes, it's too mild," returned his entertainer. It's ridiculously mild," said Tom. "Where's the door? Good night." He had another odd dream of being taken by a waiter through a mist, which, after giving him some trouble and difficulty, resolved itself into the main street, in which he stood alone. He then walked home pretty easily, though not yet free from an impression of the presence and influence of his new friend, as if he were lounging somewhere in the air, in the same negligent attitude, regarding him with the same look. The whelp went home, and went to bed. If he had had any sense of what he had done that night, and had been less of a whelp and more of a brother, he might have turned short on the road, might have gone down to the ill-smelling river that was dyed black, might have gone to bed in it for good and all, and have curtained his head forever with its filthy waters. End of Chapter 3. End of Section 10. Recording by Joseph Ugaretz. www.mountebank.org